The Newsagents USA.
I want to start tonight with the dumpster fire, that's the only way to call it, that is still raging in North Carolina. Because it's actually about more than one crazy guy. And believe me, he's definitely crazy if you've read any of the things he said. Mark Robinson, the Republican nominee for governor in North Carolina, posted a whole lot of stuff on a porn site. He called himself a black Nazi, expressed support for reinstating slavery, and called MLK an effing commie. His words, not mine. That was all according to a very thorough report from CNN that came out just last week. Now,
in a land where weird shit happens the whole time, things just got weirder. You've just heard from Mark Robinson. He is standing to be the governor of North Carolina, a critical state. And he has had to go out and deny calling himself both a black Nazi and a pervert after a story broke on CNN from a porn site traced back to him from many years ago.
Yes, on the website Nude Africa, he talked about how he'd like to see a return to slavery and would buy a few slaves himself given the opportunity. The problem is that Mark Robinson is near the top of the ticket. He has been embraced by Donald Trump in what is now a key swing state in November. So is Donald Trump going to disown him? And is this going to cost Donald Trump dearly? Welcome to Newsagents USA.
The Newsagents USA with Emily Maitlis and John Sopel.
It's Emily.
And it's John in Dublin, of all places.
And I'm imagining that your heads are kind of reeling with this introduction, because if you're not familiar with the story already, it bears us just going through a couple of the details. He has been, as John said, endorsed by Donald Trump. Not just endorsed, but likened to Martin Luther King. Just listen to Trump from a few months ago.
He's been an unbelievable Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson.
This is Martin Luther King on steroids. I think you're better than Martin Luther King. I think you are Martin Luther King times 2.
Mark Robinson, he's out there, he's fighting. He's a great one. I want to thank a very good man, and he's in there fighting. He's fighting, and we know he's a fighter. The next governor of North Carolina.
Essentially, this report by CNN dug up comments that were posted on, I think it was a transgender-specific pornographic website, in which he then goes into explanations about his love of slavery and his love of Hitler and his love of Nazism, and he essentially hasn't really been able to shrug this off. He has come out fighting, and it's quite hard for him to come out fighting because his entire team of staff have now abandoned him. They've literally all just left. But one of the most curious moments of the last few days has been when J.D. Vance, the VP presidential pick of Trump, was asked if he wanted to distance himself from Mark Robinson. And this is what Vance said, which made no sense at all.
Do you believe him that those were not his posts?
I don't not believe him. I don't believe him. I just think that you have to let these things sometimes play out in the court of public opinion. He's going to make whatever arguments he wants to make. I'm sure the news media and others are going to investigate these comments further.
He was trying to put distance as much as possible between himself and Mark Robinson without putting distance between himself and Mark Robinson. It was one of those kind of, well, if the allegations turn out to be true, then Mark Robinson will have to make for his own decisions. I think it was actually trying to say, Mark Robinson, you are utterly batshit, and this is fruitcake stuff, and forget it being Martin Luther King on steroids. It's kind of someone on hallucinatory drugs, really, given what he said.
Yeah, I think it tells us something even more nuanced, though, actually, which is the relationship between Vance and Trump. And we've seen in the past how Vance keeps getting it wrong. He'll come out with a statement and then Trump will just flat deny it or sort of contradict him. And so I think Vance is doing this shadow box behind Trump and going, well, I'm basically waiting to see if Trump distances himself. And if he does, then obviously I will. But if he doesn't, and if he doubles down, then obviously I will. And so the court of public opinion is not really what he's looking at right now. He's looking at the master himself, Trump. And I think Trump is Trump is kind of in a really odd position at this point because, as we've heard, Kamala Harris and the Democrats just keep playing that phrase on a loop about him being Martin Luther King on steroids.
Yeah, look, this is damaging. Remember, before Kamala Harris entered the race, before Joe Biden had pulled out, North Carolina was seen as an absolutely done deal for the Republicans. Donald Trump wasn't spending any money in North Carolina advertising. It was a safe Republican state. Now Kamala Harris has entered the race. You've got Mark Robinson running for governor. So he's just below, Trump and Harris on the long ticket of people to vote for. He is going to cost the Republicans dearly. And I think the moment that Donald Trump senses that he could cost him the state is when Donald Trump says, I'm pulling the emergency release catch here. Robinson, you've got to get out. But Robinson is showing absolutely no sign of doing this, as so many fruitcakes in America. He starts his speeches by talking about our Saviour Jesus Christ, wrapping himself up in religion, and describing anyone who criticizes him as nuts and freaks and oddballs, because that is the way he approaches his politics.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, Robinson is running, I think, about 8 points behind the Democrat there, Josh Stein, who is actually currently the Attorney General of North Carolina. Now, I guess the question is, the gubernatorial races aren't tied into any wider race, as in, for Congress or for the presidency. So is it just, if you're going to the polls in North Carolina, do you say, OK, Mark Robinson probably is batshit, but I still like Trump more? It doesn't actually affect the Senate race. It doesn't affect the House race. And it might not even affect the presidential race because people are learning to divide their ballots, I think, in a more sophisticated way now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that, we do see evidence of people splitting the ticket. And that is why in elections you see a senator getting elected where maybe from a different party than the person who wins the presidency, or a governor, is from a different party that wins the presidency.
The personalities do matter. They do come in.
The personalities do matter. But ideally, you want the ticket to be solid. And when you're getting a high-profile Republican like Mark Robinson getting so much attention, his top team quitting, listen to play that clip of J.D. Vance again, where he just doesn't know what to say. There are a lot of allegations in politics. There are a lot of things that get said, and they may not be true, and they may be true, and where he's got to consider his position. It's not ideal.
I tell you what we should play is a little bit more of Mark Robinson, just in case you thought the kind of Hitler slavery comments were a one-off. These are his views on women and abortion from previously.
Babies that are dying and mothers that are in trouble. Everybody knows that abortion in this country is not about protecting the lives of mothers. It is about convenience. It is about abortion on demand. That is exactly what it's about. It's about killing a child because you weren't responsible enough to keep your skirt down or your pants up and not get pregnant by your own choice because you felt like getting your groove thing on.
And if you haven't had enough Mark Robinson, here's a bit more of him defending himself on Monday after these allegations surfaced.
We're in talks right now, everything up to legal counsel to take CNN to task for what they have done to us. We are going after them, okay? We are going to go after them for what they've done. But we have 5 weeks left of this race, folks, and make no mistake about it. We are not going to let CNN throw us off of our mission. Our mission is to win this race. And quite frankly, I am dismayed about the fact, as I said before, think about how many people out there right now, right in the place where we are right now, who are hooked on fentanyl.
So he could have at that point said, none of this is true, and I would welcome an investigation, by those who understand the technology better than me as to what went on or who posted those comments. He didn't. I mean, he rejected having professionals and experts and people who are versed in technology looking into that. So you can kind of make of that what you will, I guess. And I suppose when we're talking about North Carolina and why this story seems to have come at such a critical moment. I mean, we should remember we are now 40 days out. We are 6 weeks away from the election. And in some states, that early polling, early voting has already started. I think the point is that we come back to what we know, and it's maybe the bigger story that we're telling you today, which is how tight the polls are, how deadlocked the race is between Harris and Trump right now. And that is partly because, as I think we said in the past, elections, presidential elections in America are fought in inches, not miles. There is basically a floor on what either candidate for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party will get. And that is roughly 47, 48%. So you're kind of talking about moving the dial 2%. And maybe 1% of that is undecided and isn't going to vote at all. And maybe 1% of that are the people that you're really, really talking to and targeting. And at the moment, the edge that Trump has over Harris in North Carolina is 0.2%. That's according to 538, the kind of polling gods.
The only pattern that we can see is the pattern that emerged after Joe Biden pulled out of the race. Joe Biden pulls out. Suddenly, the Democrats are competitive again, not just in the three northern industrial states of Wisconsin, Michigan and Pennsylvania, but they're competitive too in Georgia, North Carolina, and out on the West Coast in Nevada and Arizona. And that is the big change that has happened. But trying to pick them apart and say, oh, well, Harris has gone on and catapulted into the lead, or Trump has now reasserted himself and pushed himself into the lead decisively, that hasn't happened. And just underline again, what happened in Georgia last time round, 5 million people voted. The majority that Biden won by was 11,000.
Yeah.
I mean, out of 5 million people voting. It is astonishing how tight that was. And it was the same in Arizona. And there's every possibility that it will be the same again. And so if you're talking about polling evidence, where you've got a plus or minus 4% margin of error, everything is still within the margin of error.
And I think a lot of the polling is still not accurate. And I think part of it, I mean, I was talking to somebody about this over the weekend who said, you know, it's astonishing how many of the US pollsters still rely on landline calling, right? We have a very different system here now. We know exactly which pollsters use online. We know exactly which pollsters kind of target a younger demographic, people who maybe don't have landlines, who aren't sort of, you know, attached to their homes as much, which is going to give you a different result. And I'm not sure it is that clear in the US at the moment. And the kind of numbers that are coming out, and I think one is particularly important, and we're going to talk about the economy in more detail a little later, but that is the lead that Trump has over Kamala Harris. Around 11 points, he leads her on the issue of the economy. And for most people, I guess the economy is still the thing. So you are back to this place where if you are just thinking about the economy, even if you don't particularly like Trump, then you will probably vote for Trump because the economy matters. But if you think that Kamala Harris is still neck and neck, even though she's 11 points behind in the economy, I guess the flip side of that is, well, she might just close the gap because, you know, in a normal race, if somebody was 11 points behind on the economy, they would be 11 points behind in the polls everywhere.
There's a really interesting kind of truism about American politics that the Electoral College, the way it stacks up, favours Republicans, that they need to do less well and still win the presidential election. And if you cast your mind back to 2016, Hillary Clinton in the popular vote gets 3 million votes more than Donald Trump, and Donald Trump comfortably wins the Electoral College because of the way the votes stack up in individual states. I was just reading a New York Times analysis saying actually that is shifting, and the Republican advantage is nothing like as significant as it was. And therefore, Harris being competitive in these other states that are now in play does mean that potentially the Democrats could do very well, even with Trump enjoying that advantage over the economy and also over immigration as well, where, you know, Trump's policies saying I will organise the mass deportation of illegal immigrants from wherever they are, that's popular with Republicans and popular among a certain section of Democrats too. Against that, Kamala Harris's approval ratings, likability ratings, you know, have gone soaring upwards since the presidential debate. And her makeover since she entered the race has been remarkable. I mean, it really is a turnaround operation.
But one of the numbers that I keep coming back to is that with black voters, Biden won in 2020, I think it was 87% to Trump's 12%. And when you look at the polling, Kamala is on high 70s, but she's not on high 80s. And the question is, reflexively, you'd think that black voters would go for Kamala. Maybe that's naive. And the truth is that for many, the same issue stands, which is the economy. And if she doesn't manage to get to the same place as Biden did, then that could be part of the cost.
Also, I've got to say that Donald Trump has spoken in more detail about economic policy than she has. And he's talking about this new American industrialism. He did a speech in Savannah, Georgia. He was talking about the establishment of special economic zones where they would pay a lower rate of corporation tax of 15% as opposed to 21%, that anyone who wants to come and manufacture in America, there will be subsidies for them, which is not unlike, actually, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is about, bringing companies inward investment into America to lead the way in kind of developing renewable energy. But, Trump has set out quite a lot of detail. Now, there are a lot of economists who say, oh, come on, this whole idea of low tax, high tariffs, that is going to hit Americans very hard in terms of inflation. But, and we saw from 2016 to 2020, the very limited success he had in bringing back manufacturing jobs. But at least he is setting out a plan. And I think that is something where he still has a march over Kamala Harris.
Well, that takes us on brilliantly to where we will start after the break with Megan Gorman, who is the author of All the President's Money, who can actually talk us through the economics of the presidential race right now. Well, joining us now is Megan Gorman. She's the author of All the President's Money, which takes us right into the question that we were asking just before the break, which is, does it all come down to the economy for voters? And does that mean this is Trump's to lose? It's great to have you on the News Agents USA, Megan. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, I think a lot of it does come down to the economy. I think one of the challenges that both Biden and Harris have had is the U.S. economy has remained resilient through the past few years, but it depends on who you are in America if you feel the economy's strong. Right. And that is part of the challenge that I think Kamala Harris faces out there. We've had a strong stock market. We've had a really good run in this economy. We've had low unemployment and so on. The challenge is she's not as good as articulating as Trump is. He is a great master salesman. And so one of the things you're seeing across the board as the two of them are sort of going into the final part of this race is Trump is able to articulate things about, how he wants to run the economy, how he wants to stimulate it, even things like the SALT tax, the state and local tax, which he actually took away from Americans in 2017. He's now talking about giving it back to Americans. So he's much better at sort of explaining what he thinks he will do to help the economy. The challenge is when you actually start to carve into it, you have to really wonder, will it actually hurt Americans more? When economists have looked at both of their policy plans, they're saying the Harris plan will increase the deficit here by $2 million. The Trump plan by $4 trillion. And this is something that I think across the board, we've started to see both sides move away from, which is really cutting and spending. And that's the thing that I think irks a lot of Americans, particularly Americans who are in the higher income brackets.
Megan, the interesting thing that strikes me is that if you read the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, as most Americans don't, then the US economy looks pretty good. But the narrative of ordinary people on the high street who are going to the supermarket and filling their trolley, the narrative is that things are still very expensive and they've got less to spend than they did. And there seems to be a mismatch between the broad macroeconomic picture as economists judge it and what Americans feel in their heart.
Correct. And that is the hard thing, right? Going to the grocery store, has gotten incredibly expensive. And I think there's this misunderstanding about inflation here that at some point, all of the prices will go back to where they were pre-pandemic. And, while some things like used cars, that could be true, it's not going to be the case across the board. The other challenge Americans are facing is we are 5 million housing units short in this country. Now, so what you see is people are struggling to achieve what is the quote unquote American dream, which is to have their own home. So to get into a house in this country today, you really need to have 6 figures saved to meet that 20% requirement to buy in. And so if you look at both Trump and Harris's platforms, both platforms are talking about how do we get people to be building houses. And the thing that most Americans miss on this is the reason we're in this situation today is all the way going back to the 2008 economic crisis. When we went into that economic crisis, we were overbuilt. We all know that scene in The Big Short where they're driving around Florida with all those empty houses. Well, the thing is, home builders got burnt during that crisis, and they never started building at the same pace of play that they were building pre-2008. Everything has caught up to us in 2020. And the problem is today, most Americans are starting to give up on that dream of buying a home. For the average American, that doesn't work. And so, what really has to happen is American institutions really need to become more nimble, like they did in the past over the course of American history. But what's gotten harder is the influx of so much money into politics that it's becoming impossible to change some of these sort of institutions that are making Americans feel squeezed. So when people say they feel the economy isn't doing well, to them, that is their truth.
And can I ask you, in terms of, Trump is working very hard to portray Kamala Harris not as the newbie, but as the incumbent. Why is she talking about changing the economy? She's had 3.5, nearly 4 years to do it. It's a very powerful line, that. And I'm not sure that Kamala Harris has worked out her response to that. It seems to be that she's quite awkward on questions about the economy, whether it's in the debate or in the Oprah interview she did last week. She doesn't sound convincing on it.
No, I would completely agree. I think Trump is the master of the soundbite, right? And I think the thing is, Kamala sort of stumbles every time they put these questions to her. If she wants to make a difference in her polling, she really needs to be incredibly direct about where we stand in the economy.
She should say, "You're right, it's broken." We, here in this country, we've got a brand new Labour Prime Minister who has carte blanche, essentially, to say the whole system is broken because he hasn't been in power for 15 years. Does she get to say that? Should she say that?
I think she could say that, right? First of all, I think Keir doing a good job of being very direct with the British public. I think she could be a little more direct and say, look, the economy is doing well for some people and not doing well for other people. We need to pull everyone together. And if you look at her tax plan, she's very, very focused on the middle class. In fact, to some degree, I think she shoots herself in the foot with higher earners, with how she's talking about taxation. But a lot of what she wants to do with the child tax credit, the ability to give a credit for people who want to buy a house, for people starting a business, these are really key things that can help people really move forward. But she's got to admit to people that the economy is both good and bad, and that we've got to work through the parts that are challenging. And so that's where she's making sort of missteps with sort of feeling for the American public to feel that she's being direct with them. That being said, where she's frustrating high earners in this country is that all of a sudden she wants to start raising taxes across the board, right? Raising taxes on the income tax side, on the gift tax side, and on the estate tax side. And at the end of the day, when you think about America, one of the biggest groups of people are the farmers, right? And people who've built small businesses that now have made businesses go from, maybe being worth $1 million to 10 million. Today, under the Donald Trump law, you can pass as a married couple $27 million free of estate tax. That law will expire at the end of 25, and we would have went back to the Obama rule of 10 million for a married couple. Kamala wants to bring that down to 7 million for a married couple. And that's causing a lot of stress in the Midwest. It's causing a lot of stress with small businesses and with high earners who have, worked really hard to achieve the American dream. So I think she really has to think through her plans and how she's coming across to different Americans.
That is so interesting. I suppose the thing that struck me when I lived in America was that the attention to what was happening on the Dow Jones, what was happening on Wall Street and the S&P 500, people pay much more attention in America to stock prices than we do in Britain. And I suspect that's because more Americans have got some money in the stock market than Britons typically do. We've had 3 days of record highs following the cut in interest rates by the Fed last week. Doesn't that help Kamala Harris?
You would think, right? And again, it's all about the messaging. For a lot of Americans, why they're so focused on the stock market is, one, we're being told to focus on it, right? And in particular, during the Trump era of the presidency, he talked about it constantly. But more importantly, most Americans' financial futures are tied to the stock market. Today, I think it's 21% of Americans have pensions. All the rest of us are forced to, rely on our 401ks, our 403bs. So being focused on the stock market is really important. In terms of rates coming down, what's really complex is most people believe if rates come down, so do mortgage rates. And they don't correlate exactly, right? The mortgage rates are much more tied to the bond market. And so I think that you're hearing a little bit of frustration across the board because people thought that they were going to be able to refinance immediately. And what they're finding is, while rates have softened a bit in the mortgage market, they're not coming down as quickly as most people thought they would. So again, all of these different things are making people feel like they just can't get ahead. And that's one of the hard things. When Trump talks about economic policy, about tax policy, he's very good at selling it. But the actual issues that he talks about might be actually more detrimental for Americans.
When Trump and Kamala talk about personal wealth, what happens to the voter's mind? Because here, we're in the middle of a very sort of minor but slightly aggravating sort of sleaze scandal about, it sounds so petty. It's about whether our politicians are allowed to borrow or be gifted clothes. Not borrow, but be gifted sort of clothes. And over there, I'm trying to work out whether anyone cares if the people running those campaigns have too much money. And my guess is they don't.
No. Well, so first of all, you've got a couple things going on here. And Pew Research just did a study on this. 63% of all Americans are incredibly frustrated by the conflicts that politicians have and the fact that most people they believe most people go into politics to make money. What's fascinating about Trump and Kamala is you've got two different bookends in American life. Kamala's coming from the middle class. She talks about it constantly. And when you carve into her portfolio, what we've seen since 2016 is an evolution to someone who's become incredibly conflict-free. Now, she obviously has pensions from her time in San Francisco and the state of California, but she today has an ETF portfolio that basically doesn't favor one stock over the other. Very diversified. At the same time, her husband had a really big job at a big law firm in LA. He gave up all of his partnership interests. So what you see is this divestment of conflict from her portfolio. You go and look on the Trump side, very different way to look about money, right? He's generational wealth transfer, and he's generation 2. He inherited $400 million from generation 1. Trump's job is to pass his wealth, not to, his children, but really his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. Very different mindset in how you approach things. And so being savvy on taxes, which is what he does, I'm not saying he's always right on how he practices his taxes, but he's very good at understanding what irks upper middle class Americans in terms of their money. He's good at hitting those buttons because he understands most people want to build a legacy to pass to their kid.
So what you're saying is nobody minds a rich presidential candidate. They don't mind that about Trump at all, right?
No, because here's the thing, and this might sound weird, but Trump is what most people think rich people should be like. Now, when you actually look at really wealthy people, most of them are far more subdued and they're not as, in your face about the money. But for people who don't have money, he embodies the American dream. He looks like success. People don't want to hear about low income. They don't want to hear about middle class. They want to hear about aspirational, even if they can't get there. So there's a lot of practicality on the Harris side that most Americans should aspire to be like her. But they look at Trump and they think that's what they should go for. And the truth is, most of them are at the same pace that like Tim Walz, our vice presidential candidate in the Democratic side. Tim Walz doesn't have a really big net worth, has pensions, sold his house when he became governor of Minnesota, borrowed against his 403B to get his kids through college. He's where most Americans are. And it's a tragedy in that sense because he represents that struggle that Americans have today that they didn't have 40, 50, 60 years ago. And that's the real rub, I think, in American life today.
You seem to be saying that, look, if it's going to come down to the economy, the chips are with Trump.
If it comes down to the economy, I think that he sells the plan much more believably. Do I believe we will stop taxing Social Security benefits and tips? Or tips that like service workers make. I find that hard to believe that they'll be able to get that over the finish line. But I think he's promising a rosier situation. I think that she's promising a more practical solution. And so when it comes down to this, they keep saying it's a knife fight in a phone booth here. And I think that it's going to be a real toss-up.
Megan Gorman, fantastic to have you on. Really, really
Brilliant.
Interesting. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I always thought women liked me. I never thought I had a problem. You will be protected, and I will be your protector. Women will be happy, healthy, confident, and free. You will no longer be thinking about abortion.
There is a very, very strong chance that there has never been a presidential candidate who has ever hated women more in history than Donald Trump. But yesterday on the campaign rally, you heard him deciding to be the protector of women, which not only obviously leaves a few jaws slack, found liable for sexual abuse, etc., several times, but also just the pattern of that narrative, the pattern of how patronising it sounds, that he thinks of women in those terms, needing him as a protector. It's like getting a Saudi Arabian man to drive your car, frankly.
Well, honestly, to say that women are going to be so happy with him as president that they won't need to think about abortion. Abortion won't be the furthest thing from their mind because he's going to bring happiness to the United States of America. It just doesn't bear relation to reality. And given that the voting in this election, we spoke earlier about the number of black people voting for Trump as opposed to Harris and how that might be a problem for Harris. There is also a danger that it becomes a problem for Donald Trump, that women are going to think, is this guy really talking to me, given what's happened with Roe versus Wade, given what's happened in all sorts of states where they've made abortion virtually impossible and you now have to travel across America to get this done. And just to say, oh, people are going to be so happy, just doesn't seem to bear any relationship to reality.
I think Trump lets slip sometimes in these sort of meandering moments of the campaign rally what he wishes would happen as opposed to what is happening. So what he really means there is, I wish people wouldn't think about abortion. But the point is, no woman in America actually was thinking about abortion until he came along and the Dobbs ruling facilitated the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That's the point. There was no conversation about abortion, really, until that moment. And he's now essentially telling people at his rallies, I just wish it would go away.
By talking about it, you draw attention to it, and the clip gets played out as we're playing it out now, and people think, has he got any idea? We talk about the things that are under the surface in American elections where the pollsters find it hard to find out what is happening. I mean, my side bet is on young people going out to vote in higher numbers and women going out to vote in higher numbers as a result of these issues.
Yeah, and this is not a projection by any means, but I think I'm right in saying that the Democrats haven't lost a substantial election since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. They keep winning on the issue of abortion. And that's why Trump wants to turn the subject off and why he keeps mentioning it by mistake?
Well, I suppose they would say, Republicans would say, look, we retook the House in 2022, but they didn't take the House with anything like the majority that had been anticipated, and part of that was down to Roe versus Wade. It's certainly true to say where abortion has been on the ballot in Ohio, Kentucky and Kansas, people have voted, women have voted in these rock-red Republican states for a woman's right to choose.
We'll be back next week with happier news. Maybe.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents USA.